Okay, guys, now we're on to the last little piece of the blood vessels and blood lecture. And now we're going to talk about the blood, looking at the different types of cells in that blood. So when you take blood and you take that blood and you spin it, what that does is you put it in a centrifuge, that's what the machine is called. That's going to separate it by the components. And so there's two major types of components in the blood. You have the liquid part, which is called plasma. That would be the matrix, since this is a connective tissue. That's the plasma there. And then you have what's called formed elements. And formed elements just means that it is either a cell or a piece of a cell. Okay, so the three different form elements are the red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, the white blood cells, also known as leukocytes, and then the platelets, which are also known as thrombocytes. Okay, so the general function of the red blood cells is to carry oxygen, and I do want you to know these general functions. The general function of the white blood cells is for immunity. What they do is circulate around and try and find anything that is foreign and destroy it. And then the function of the platelets is going to be to form blood clots to prevent you from bleeding out. Let's start with the red blood cells. Now, the red blood cells you've actually seen in lab already when we talked about tissues. Remember that blood is a connective tissue. And so when you look through the microscope for blood, almost everything that you saw, those are going to be the red blood cells. And the red blood cells are very, very small. I called them Dippin' Dots because when you look through, you just see a huge field of tiny little pink dots. And those are the red blood cells. And then you notice in the red blood cells, they kind of have this whitish appearance in the middle. That's because instead of being round, those red blood cells are concave, which just means if you took like a round ball of Play-Doh and you squished it with your thumb, that's what they would look like. And so they have this indent in the middle. So they're thinner in the middle and kind of thicker around the edges. And that's why in the microscope, they're going to be thicker in the middle and they're kind of translucent in the middle. That's because of that concave shape. Okay, and the reason they have made that concave shape is because when you have that shape, it makes it so that they have more surface area per total volume. So their surface area to volume ratio is much greater, and that's going to help with exchange, because remember the function of the red blood cells is to carry oxygen. And so the easier it is to transfer the oxygen through the plasma membrane, so exchange with the tissues, the more efficient it is at getting the oxygen to the cells of the body. Okay, so the concave shape increases the surface area. Now, the second one that we need to talk about is the nucleus. Red blood cells are anucleated, which just means they do not have a nucleus. And the reason they do not have a nucleus is because if you think back to that, remember the cell model? That big structure in the middle, the nucleus is rather large. So if you take that nucleus out, what you now have is more internal space to pack in more hemoglobin, which is the protein that carries that oxygen. Okay, so more internal space means better able to carry more oxygen, which means that they're better at their job. So the red blood cells are highly, highly modified to be very, very good at carrying that oxygen. Okay, so no nucleus means more internal space. Remember, internal space, internal volume, which allows them to carry more oxygen. And the concave shape makes it so that you have increased surface area. So remember, surface area is the space just at the surface, and that's going to help make it so that the oxygen is coming through the cell wall much more easily and allows for easier gas exchange. Okay, on to white blood cells. For the white blood cells, the general term for all the white blood cells is called a leukocyte. But there are several different types of leukocytes, and so you do need to be able to recognize and identify the different types. So I'm going to try to give you some strategies. The first one is whether or not they have little dots, and those little dots are called granules. So the ones that have granules are generally called granulocytes. Remember, cyte means cells, granules because they have granules. The three ones that have the granules are the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the basophils. Now, between those three, though, the eosinophils and the basophils, they have very, very obvious large granules, whereas the neutrophil ones, their granules are kind of small, so it looks more like texturing than it does look like actual granules. Okay, so for the eosinophils, they're going to have lighter staining pink granules, and the basophils are going to have very, very dark granules. So I like to think of these as like purple grapes. That's what they look like in the microscope, just like a cluster of purple grapes. If you see a cluster of purple grapes, that's going to be the basophil. If you see a cluster of light pink ones, that's going to be an eosinophil. Now, the distinguishing characteristic for the neutrophil is not actually the granules, it's the nucleus. So generally when we think of a nucleus, we think of like one circle in it, but you can have nuclei in multiple different shapes. And so your second strategy is going to be the shape of the nucleus. If the nucleus is all chopped up and it's got between 3 to 5 lobes, what I mean by lobe is here's one lobe, another lobe, and another lobe. So this one here has 1, 2, 3 lobes, and this one has 1, 2, 3, 4 lobes. If the nucleus is all kind of broken apart into pieces like that, that's going to be a neutrophil. If it's got 3 to 5 lobes, that's a neutrophil. Whereas the lymphocytes and the monocytes, they are agranulated, and whenever you see an A at the beginning of a word, that means it's missing whatever's after it. So agranulocytes are cells that miss the granules. So they won't have any granules, but the better way to distinguish these is to look at the shape and size of the nucleus. If the nucleus is very round, and very, very round, and it takes up most of the cytoplasm because the cell itself is kind of small, but the nucleus is nice and big, that's going to be a lymphocyte. And if the nucleus has a kidney bean shaped nucleus, see it has that indent right there, that's going to be a monocyte. The other thing is those monocytes are the largest white blood cell, in fact, the largest blood cell at all. And so those are going to be very distinctive because they're nice and big. Okay, so let's look at what it would look like in the microscope, because I'm probably not going to use a diagram like this. I'm probably going to use a picture from a microscope. Okay, so let's look at what it looks like. When you look through the microscope, you're going to see, or you would have seen a bunch of pink dots all over the place. Those pink dots are called erythrocytes, which are red blood cells. Okay, they're all over the place. And notice that they don't have any nucleus at all, right? They kind of look empty inside. Then the next most common blood cell is going to be the neutrophil. So the neutrophils are the most abundant white blood cell or leukocyte. And the distinguishing characteristic for those neutrophils is the presence of chopped up nucleus, right? So here, here it has 1, 2, 3 lobes of the nucleus, and so that is going to be a neutrophil. Whereas these ones here, okay, these ones, and you can also kind of see a little bit of granules there, but these ones here, if you look at their nucleus, it's a very large round nucleus. It takes up most of the cytoplasm, kind of dead smack in the middle. That's going to be a lymphocyte. And this one, if you look at it, see how it makes like a kidney bean shape where it's kind of got that indent right there? That's going to be a monocyte, and it's going to be the largest white blood cell or the largest leukocyte. Leukocyte is the generic term for all of the white blood cells. Then let's return our attention to these. So the eosinophils and the basophils, those are also granulocytes, but those granulocytes have very large very obvious looking granulocytes. Here we have a bunch of purple grapes. Okay, so very large granulocytes are so big and a dark staining, they're actually blocking out what the nucleus looks like, and so that's going to be a basophil. Whereas the eosinophil also has a large granule. See how it has those kind of large pink dots all in it? But they're much lighter staining, and so you can still see the nucleus here. So that's going to be an eosinophil. Okay, so here's what you need to know for those blood cells. You need to be able to recognize them by a type, by a description, or the picture, most likely picture. You need to know which one is most numerous. The most numerous cell type of all the blood cells is definitely going to be a red blood cell or erythrocyte. And the most numerous white blood cell type is going to be a neutrophil. Neutrophil for sure. So what is this one here? Okay, so all of these on the side, those are all erythrocytes, red blood cells. This one in the circle here, it does have some little granules, so it's one of the granulocytes, but those granules are not very obvious, not very dark staining, so it's not a basophil and it's not a eosinophil. And so the next thing to look at is the nucleus. There's 1, 2, 3 circles in it, so three lobes of the nucleus. So this must be a neutrophil. Okay, for this one, no granules, super round nucleus. This must be a lymphocyte. Okay, so that's good for now.